whole concept of stewardship and how it relates to the spiritual life. We've talked a lot about how the Eucharist is an example of the stewardship, how God gives us good things and we take them, we put our best work into it, we transform the grapes and the wheat into bread and wine, we give it to God, God transforms it into his very body and blood and gives it back to us and transforms us. And this kind of this giving and receiving of stewardship and how it applies in the Eucharist as an example of how we should be doing this throughout our whole lives, where we recognize that everything we've been given has been given by God and doesn't really belong to us, and how we need to give that back to God, and the way we give it back to God is by giving and sharing our love with other people in real, tangible, material ways, not just kind of cheap words. And this is why Christ says to his disciples, they will know you by your love. And love here, he doesn't mean like some sort of feeling you have in your heart, but he means real action, right? Like, you want to show somebody you love them, it's like, I love you, right? Well, prove it, right? How are you going to prove you love somebody? You're going to do something, right? And probably something that shows some sort of sacrifice on your part, right? That's a real sign that you love somebody. And so today I want to talk specifically about how we give away kind of our wealth and our resources, our money, right? We talked last time about time, how we give our time and volunteering to other people, and so we're going to talk about money. It's funny that it wasn't planned at all. It just happens to be that this gospel reading today is the Gospel of Lazarus, which is precisely about the topic that I'm preaching on, which is just purely coincidental. But it's a great example how in the Gospel of Luke, more so than the other Gospels, there's a real emphasis on compassion. And by that I mean specifically caring for the poor and the needy. And more so in any other Gospel, in Luke, Jesus speaks about money and how you use your money. And it's funny, you'd think, people talk like, don't talk about religion, don't talk about politics, don't talk about money, right? Those kind of things. The Gospels tend to break all those. And more than any other moral topic, Jesus talks about money. And really, money and how we use our money is really a moral issue. It always is. And so our checkbook or our bank account is really a moral statement of our life. And this is really challenging because this kind of hits hard. Like a lot of times it's easy maybe to come to church or to pray or to fast, and other stuff. But giving away your money is probably one of the hardest Christian practices that we have. It's a real challenge. And what Jesus shows us is that unlike in the Old Testament where the Jews were called to give a 10%, a tithe, in the New Testament, the Christians are called to give 100%. If you look in the book of Acts, they're called to give absolutely everything. And it says they actually lived in common, which means they shared all their wealth as if everyone else owned it. I mean, it was pretty radical very early on. And you had a scene with Ananias and Sapphira in the book of Acts, where they sold a piece of property and then they gave the proceeds of that to the church. And they went and they presented it to Peter, the Apostle Peter. And Apostle Peter, what they did is they said that they were giving all of the money, but they were actually keeping part of it, right? So I said they sold it for $100,000, and then they go to Apostle Peter, like, oh, we sold our land, it was $50,000, we're giving the church all of our money, right? But they weren't, they were keeping some of it, so they were lying, right? So there's some vanity, they wanted to look like they were doing something good, right? But they weren't. And so, the short of it is, I think it was Ananias who came first, and he presented this, and he said, basically Peter says, you're lying, and today your life is required of you, and he just falls dead right there. And everyone in the church is like freaking out, right? They're like shocked, right? And then his wife comes in, and she tells the same lie, not knowing what just happened to her husband, and then she's also struck dead like that at the word. And so it says great fear came over the church. And so we can see sort of the radical call that's in the gospel, but it shouldn't be surprising because really the kind of challenges that we're given in the gospel are always radical in terms of their moral weight for our life. So when we think of what belongs to God, the point is not that Ananias and Sapphira had to give 100%, right? The problem is that they lied about it. right? It was kind of up to them to determine what they could afford to give and where they were at spiritually and what they were able to do. And the point was that they were supposed to be giving out of a generous and honest heart. And they weren't doing that. And so in the Old Testament, there's this rule of 100%, right? And it's very fixed. In the New Testament, there's not any clear line that's drawn of how much you're supposed to give, because you're supposed to give everything. Which means our money, the money that belongs to God and to each other, right? And to our fellow man, isn't just the money we give away, but it's also all of our money, which means it's how we spend our money, right? It's how we save it, it's how we use it in any facet. And so when we're thinking of how we're using our money, it's not just, are we giving enough to the poor, are we giving enough to the church, but it's also, how are we spending the money and how are we using it? And are we using it well? Are we spending it on things that are worthwhile? And so we're all kind of called to make an examine of our own life and just, once in a while stop and think. Sometimes maybe end of the year or tax year is a good time to do that. Is to just take the time to evaluate, how did I do this year? How did I do with my money? Am I doing what I envision myself doing, right? Did I meet my own expectations and standards for myself? And that's a good time to evaluate that. And so really, in the New Testament, we're called to give everything. And the reason for this is that God's not interested in kind of setting up minimums for our spiritual life, right? Because the whole point of generosity and gratitude is not saying, how little can I give, right? But what more can I do, right? So if you love somebody, right? And this is always the sign of when relationships start kind of breaking down, is you start shifting from, what else can I do to impress my loved one, right? To, what else do I have to do so that she doesn't nag me, right? And this shift happens, right? But we do it with a lot of relationships. We do it with marriage, we do it with friends, we do it with family. We turn kind of gratitude and love into kind of dry obligations that we have to do, and it's just so that we don't have problems with other people. And we do that with our spiritual life as well. We do the same thing. We turn things into obligations. But really, they're meant to be something a bit more spontaneous and authentic. And it's difficult to force that, but we should try to do what we can to cultivate that sort of a heart and an attitude in our entire spiritual life. So, one of the chief benefits to giving of our wealth and our money, and Christ makes this very clear in the Gospels, is that we're giving not because so much that there's a need for us to give, right? And not that the other person needs us to give, right? Like someone's poor and we're supposed to give them money. Or the church has bills they have to pay, and so we need to give money for the church to pay their bills. That's really a real secondary concern in the whole discussion in the Gospels about how we use our money and giving it. Okay? And this might seem strange, but this is really true, so follow me on this. The main point of giving is that you need to get rid of the money. Okay? So even if you were to burn some of your money, there would still be a spiritual benefit in that. And that is, you're delivering yourself from a addiction, from a kind of false dependency upon the security that money seems to give you, or the pleasures that come from it, or the sense of power and control that you have by possessing it. And so the idea is that you need to get rid of your money for your own sake. And see, this is the principle in just about every spiritual practice. When we give, we are the primary point of benefit. When we pray, it's not God who's benefited, it's us. When we come to church, right? When we volunteer our time, it's us who are blessed, usually a whole lot more than the person who's receiving. And this is true for any encounter or experience where we are giving of ourselves in some way, whether it's our time or our money or our hearts in some way. It's the one who gives the love who is usually blessed far greater than the one who's receiving. It's great to get a nice present, but have you ever had that experience where you get somebody a gift that you know they like, it's just the right gift, and you watch them open it or receive it, and you see the expression on your face? How valuable is that? That's usually a wonderful experience to have with somebody. And so that's the idea, is that like fasting, where we give up food because we need to train ourselves, The giving of money is a spiritual exercise for us to acquire virtue. Virtues like generosity and self-control, right? And to have a level of freedom from money in our life. So I just want to read you this one quote by St. John Chrysostom. I think it's an interesting quote. It says, "Do you see that our practice has more power to do good? And by spiritual practices, I mean not chiefly your fasting, but rather your despising of wealth as it ought to be despised. If you are kindly affectionate, if you give your bread to the hungry, if you control your anger, if you cast out vanity, if you put away envy. And all this I say not to depreciate fasting, God forbid, but rather highly to commend it. But I grieve when charity and almsgiving are placed last among Christian duties. For the greatest thing is charity and moderation and almsgiving, which hits the highest mark of all." So it's really clear about that. Like the greatest spiritual act and practice that you can do as a Christian is to give of your time and money to somebody who's in need out of a real, genuine heart of love. That is really the highest thing. And when we see Christ on the cross, we see what he did for us is he showed us what it means to give your whole life for somebody else, right? So that he could set an example for us of how we ought to live, to also be crucifying ourselves and giving away. And that means that the Christian life is inescapably sacrificial, which means it's going to cost us something. But anything of any real value or worth is going to cost us something. Now, in the epistle, in the gospel today, with Lazarus and the rich man, we have a great lesson, and that is we can't delay in our giving. Right? Oftentimes we say to ourselves, well, I'll give when I have more money, or I'll give after I pay this down, or whatever. We have excuses, but we see what happens with the rich man when you delay the practice of virtues and charity. Is that you don't know when your life is snatched from you. And so now he's down in the underworld, right, and afterworld, and he's regretting all this stuff, and he's asking Abraham, right, and Lazarus, to go and warn and tell his family, right? But the revelation is that he and his family who are still alive have and had all the warning that they needed. And so, just like there was this poor man, Lazarus, at the front gate, in each of our lives, at our own front gates, right? Right next to us, there are people who are in need, right? In some way. And the question is, do we recognize them? Maybe we're not intentionally neglecting these people, right? But maybe we're blind to them because we don't have a disposition that notices the needs of other people and is genuinely moved to compassion. And so we have these kind of two struggles in our Christian life, or these two motivations in our Christian life: to give because there's a need that's clearly present, and also to give because we need to get rid of the money. And both of those things are the motivations for why we give. So even if, say, our church had all the money it needed and it didn't need any more, it didn't need to pay any more bills, that doesn't mean we should stop giving, or now I can give less because there's a less of a need. Right? That's really the wrong way to think. The thing is, how much more can I give? Because even if I'll just find somewhere else I can give that needs money, or that needs help. Because the point is that I need to deliver myself from the grip that money has on my life. And we live in a world, in a society, where money has a very strong grip on our lives, where it's promoted and it's encouraged to have that. And so as Christians, we need to work doubly hard to rid ourselves of that kind of a mentality that we live in this world. So, to give you some practical advice when you're thinking about how can I give of my own money in some way, it's this kind of principle of what's called proportional giving. So you sit down ahead of time and you're intentional about how you give, right? You don't haphazardly just throw money whenever you happen to be in church, but you sit down and you think, what can I give? Can I give 2% of the money that I make? Can I give 3%? Can I give 8%? What can I give? So you sit down and you figure out, what's this percentage that I can give? And am I going to give it every month or every week? And how am I going to do that, right? And then it's important to set goals, right? So like if you're going to exercise, you're going to get in shape, you have to have real concrete goals, right? Or if anyone's been to business school, you know that if you're setting a business plan, you have to have very clear and achievable goals, right? And no one, because you can't measure success or failure, and no one's going to invest in your business if they don't know what your goals are. Like, what are you trying to accomplish? What kind of market share are you trying to capture? And it's important to have goals because it makes it concrete in some way. So I encourage you to think about setting a percentage for yourself, a frequency for where you give, and also who you're giving to. Is it the church? Is it some other charities? Is it some person in particular that you're kind of supporting as a benefactor in some way? Where are the places that you're giving your money to? And this same principle of proportional giving can work for your time, or how much time you give to the church, but it is a very helpful tool when giving for the money, because it also helps you not to set any sort of minimum, right? Like, I just have to give this much every time, but rather, I give a certain percentage, and then every year, you can evaluate where you're at. How did I do this year? Can I give a little bit more? Can I give a little bit less? And then you can see how you're matching up to the goals that you're setting. This is how I would encourage us to, how we can practically avoid the pitfall that the rich man fell into in today's gospel. And that was going through life and accidentally neglecting, as John Chrysostom says, the most important Christian practice of all, which is giving of our money to those in need. And it's a real danger. This rich man was not a bad man. He was a neglectful man. And it's easy for us to be the same. So let's encourage ourselves and remind ourselves that giving of our wealth is an important and very central Christian practice. Glory to Jesus Christ.
Glory to God.